Hi, I'm Dr. Greig Paul and I head up mobile networks and cybersecurity at the University of Strathclyde. We're working on a number of testbed and trials projects that have been looking at, improving rural connectivity and specifically at some of the opportunities of neutral hosts in private networks. In terms of my background, I've worked in the mobile sector for quite some time, originally doing consulting in the US with carriers that were, operating on a local basis, getting better connectivity and improving the networks. And, more recently in terms of the IP voice rollout, getting voice over Wi-Fi and voice over LTE to work. Recently, I've been working an awful lot on, 5G and cybersecurity in telecoms networks. Let's get started and I'll talk briefly about some rural case studies around mobile networks and where neutral host can actually start to play in. And this is all done in the context of building private networks for testbeds, but clearly there's some learnings that we can perhaps take from there for other things. So let's start with where Orkney is. To answer this question, we have to go north, actually really quite far north, to the north of Scotland, into a group of islands off the top of the coast, and there's about 70 islands in total. 20 of them are permanently inhabited, one of which actually just has a single resident, so this is pretty rural. Orkney's got a very significant population. In fact, it has almost 23,000 people living there, and it has had, until recently, a very significant tourist industry, with some major historic sites, including some of the world's oldest buildings, actually there. It was also host to Scotland's busiest port, and therefore it was a passenger port, so it's got all the people coming in, and these tourists are needing to be, first off brought to Orkney, and then taken around Orkney to see all the sites. And it's not just all about tourism. There are some major exports from Orkney, including salmon and whisky. Actually, salmon was until about March of this year the UK's biggest food export. So I think we can all guess why that was overtaken by chocolate, but perhaps that will return to normal at some point. In any case, we recognised an opportunity when we were in Orkney to do better for the people in terms of getting them connected. Local mobile networks of for a rural area like this are generally specified and built on a basis of baseline connectivity to the towns, and rather than in a sort of let's get 100% coverage. So they've been built in a rural design. There's kind of 4G access on the main island, and there's generally 2 or 3G access on the outer islands if you're lucky. And one of the use cases we're working on was to build a private mobile network in order to deliver coverage to a tourist bus route, so that they would be able to use their phones, and tourists actually really liked this. But on the side of this, what we actually noticed was something quite unexpected. In a period of about 6 months, we found that there were more than 65,000 visitors whose devices actually tried to connect to our network. This was a private network, so they weren't able to get on and get a service. And of these, about 30,000 were roaming. So clearly there's an interesting commercial aspect here as well if you're an operator in terms of getting access to roaming users, especially those arriving at a port. And all in all, there were 4 million access attempts made to join the network that were of course rejected because they didn't have access to the network. But this got us thinking about the level of connectivity need, and that this actually demonstrated that there was a challenge and there was a market for improved connectivity in these areas, and that the people are there that would benefit from it. So this was a successful project, but it got us really thinking about neutral hosting and some of the opportunities that this might afford rural communities that are perhaps struggling for connectivity. And then, this was all discussed in the past before March, but, we started to see connectivity problems elsewhere that, of course, have now been emphasised with the work from home trends. So when the opportunity came along late last year to partner with another local authority, actually in a very different part of the UK, in fact, down on the south coast of England in Dorset, not far off as far as you can get from Orkney, it seemed a really good opportunity to see if we could take what we learned from Orkney and actually apply this elsewhere and get more people better connected and share the learnings wider from this. So this led into the 5G Rural Dorset project, which is a project funded by DCMS, which is the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. And this is part of the 5G testbed and trials programme that's been going on for the past few years in the UK. To give you a little overview of the project in Dorset, we're building this network around the idea of 4 different use cases for 5G networks. The first is coastal connectivity. So this is looking primarily at public safety use cases, emergency response. Dorset has a wonderful coastline and it's one that people should enjoy responsibly, but you do have to keep your wits about you. There are lots of cliffs and other hazards, and people need to be very aware of the weather and the tides, and there's opportunities for digital signage and other safety improvements in the areas there. We're working with a range of partners, including also one of the local internet providers that specialises in agriculture and aquaculture use cases, and they're very keen to look at whether private 5G networks can be used to really, change the economics of building and deploying connectivity in some really rural areas where it's not commercially sustainable to actually do a 5G network today on a commercial basis. And that's going to be true for a lot of rural areas. Let's not kid ourselves here. 5G is going to be expensive, and if you go and deploy it in the traditional commercial way, it's not going to be straightforward to do commercially feasibly. We're also looking at the 5G Innovation Park, which is effectively an open access testbed and lab that would be to allow local businesses and other businesses that want to come to Dorset to get a chance to actually get hands-on with some kit in a safe environment where, if they break things, it's not the end of the world, and they can learn, what the 5G technology can do for them, what kind of use cases make sense. And finally, the Rural Business Accelerator, which is looking at taking existing businesses and helping them to make the most of better connectivity. So at a time, where people might have forgotten, but, cash payments are, actually the norm in a lot of rural communities, and not out of choice, but actually because there isn't the connectivity to get a card machine online, either fixed or mobile. So there's a whole host of use cases here, but these are really important because these are what drive us to do better connectivity and really motivate us to try and get things better for people that live in Dorset. But it's not just as simple as that. Dorset has its own unique challenges. It's the county in the UK with the most advanced ageing population right now. I think 28% of the population of Dorset is over the age of 65. And they've had some real challenges with shielding, of course, with an ageing population and large numbers of people that were previously not known to the council actually requiring support. In the next 10 years, it's expected that there'll be a 20% increase in the number of people over the age of 85 living in Dorset, and that has clear health and social care implications. And for a council that spends already 50% of its entire operating budget on health and social care provision, this is really important. And at the same time, there are real challenges in delivering. You can't just go and make connectivity better. 54% of Dorset is an area of outstanding natural beauty, and that means that infrastructure is hard to do. Even if you decide and you get the money and you get the investment, you decide you're going to do it, there are still some barriers in the way, and we're looking at what these are and how we can make these better. But it's not only the elderly who are struggling with limited connectivity just now. Local authorities have a responsibility, of course, for education, and students and young people are definitely struggling right now. We've seen video lessons effectively become the norm for large numbers of people. There's already lots of speculation, at least at the time I'm recording this, about whether they will be, returning as the norm as we head into winter, and even actually potentially as we leave winter as well. So there's been lots of discussion about this at school, college, and university level. But at the moment, we've got to remember that it is actually a postcode lottery for a lot of people as to the level of connectivity they've got, fixed and mobile, and whether they're going to be able to get online to meaningfully partake in their video lessons. And it's important that we get this connectivity everywhere, because the elderly, the vulnerable, and the young live all over the county. Dorset, it has a great spread of population all over the place, and it's really important that we do make sure everybody is connected and online, especially as, even social interactions have been pushed to the internet, much more so than ever before. And as I say, this applies to fixed connectivity, but also mobile as well, because alternative network providers can lay in fibre, but that only goes so far and only so quickly. But this doesn't also get you straight onto mobile connectivity. So even if we do lay that fibre, we want to get mobile as well, because it enables so many more things and use cases that we all know about. There's also a number of challenges in the economics of doing 5G in rural, and it's worth recapping on these. These are important, but we all mostly know about them. So there are some challenges with propagation of 5G, especially in the mid-band frequencies. Once you get into the gigahertz ranges and you start to have 3 gigahertz signals, you're going to need more base stations. They won't need to be necessarily as high a power as you might have thought, but you will need more of them. And as the frequency goes up, the radio waves get blocked by more and more things. The other things that we need to think about again is, how do we work out the way we deploy a network? Population density and traditional ARPU metrics aren't really going to be necessarily as helpful in 5G networks. There's a lot of things that are perhaps not visible to operators right now, such as, the growth in IoT SIMs that are on thick MVNOs, and also the fact that, population density as a metric, once tourism returns to normal, is actually maybe not the best way to work out where 5G is going to benefit people the most. If you look at the population density of a lot of major stations in the UK, it's actually not very high, but the number of people that are going through them, at 5 p.m. and at 8 a.m. is actually really significant. So some of these traditional metrics are not working anymore, And for the advantages of 5G, we really need to look at what we can do to better understand where people need and use and benefit from connectivity. And there's also a challenge around a perception, I think, in some cases, that from some perspectives, it's actually better to deliver a consistent quality of service rather than an inconsistent one, which is understandable. But the problem is this can be taken also and extended to mean it's actually better to consistently deliver no service than it is to make best endeavours to deliver a good service. And we need to make sure that we don't allow this to get in the way of progress in delivering connectivity to people, especially in rural areas where having triple redundant backhaul is going to be incredibly expensive to do if you need 3 completely different fibre lays to go in. Perhaps that's a time where you're going to say, actually, people have nothing right now. We should put in one and give them a service rather than leave them with nothing. One of the biggest challenges, of course, in solving connectivity in rural areas in the past has been the need to build out multiple competing networks. The UK government and the operators have recently reached a shared rural network agreement that's going to end up spending, I think, in total about £1 billion, and it's going to be trying to address total and partial not-spot connectivity. Now, one of the challenges that's been seen up to date is that actually building 4 mobile networks is really expensive, or building 2 if you think about the RAN share agreements that we've got. But it's not guaranteed that even with this it will go far enough. And if every operator is installing their own equipment on the shared mast with the shared power and perhaps the shared backhaul, total not-spots are really rural. There are lots of them, and large amounts of Dorset are actually not very commercially feasible or attractive to go and install even on a shared basis. So with all the potential that there is for IoT devices to help people improve business and actually make even delivery of public services better affordable and give a better service, there's some real questions to be asked here around how we do get every home, every business online. And how do we make sure that people have this connectivity where they need it and benefit from it the most? But once you have a private network, if you do build one of the opportunities that's going to come up is actually to use the network as a neutral host operator and be able to provide connectivity or services to other operators. And this could be a private network. It could also, of course, be a public network. But in the context of this talk, we wanted to look at what some of the challenges might be for a private network to do this. So customer experience is often cited as one of the biggest challenges. Networks want to make sure people get a good experience, especially if it's done so under their own brand. And what I think this looks like actually from what we've seen is that we need to find ways to support seamless connectivity across neutral host-based networks, including when you enter and leave them on and off the traditional network. And these traditional networks, of course, are built around homogeneous RANs where each zone uses the same vendor of radio. It's unlikely that a neutral host operator is going to be using the same radio, especially in a rural area where the commercials are a challenge. We all know the list pricing of the big tier 1 radios, but actually, this is a significant barrier to deployments in rural communities. And these are actually the areas where some of the innovative players in radio can make all the difference in terms of becoming commercially feasible to deploy. We're also going to need to find workable models to deliver, a better quality of service to people, including things like handovers, for example, because we want to make sure that customers of every operator are going to get a good experience and that handovers, between neutral hosted sites and also non-neutral hosted sites on the host networks are actually going to be seamless. There's also various challenges around spectrum. Spectrum is, of course, one of the big things that we always talk about in building a mobile network. Ofcom in the UK has been incredibly helpful in terms of the spectrum sharing, making it possible to actually gain access to spectrum on a local basis, either from a mobile operator or from dedicated sharing spectrum allocations. Operators, of course, have concerns, and when you're building a neutral host, we just need to make sure that that we don't have barriers forming around things like access to spectrum, particularly where people are concerned about quality of service over who gets access to how much spectrum and whose customers get it, where in fact actually this discussion may be academic. We may be talking about fighting out over who's going to get access to the spectrum when there's 2 users that are going to use the cell 98% of the time. So when we are building out a private network, something that we thought about that was kind of 4 points I wanted to bring out that we thought were worth sharing as enablers actually rather than problems. We've talked lots about problems, but let's talk about some of the good things. So backhaul is clearly something that's incredibly important. If you want to build a network, you need backhaul, you need power. If you don't have these, you might as well just give up and not do it because it's not going to happen without backhaul. Now, getting backhaul connectivity and power, well, there's various ways that we can go about doing this. And what we've found actually is that working with local people is one of the best ways to do it. Local people know their communities, they know the people around them, they know their neighbours, and they'll really come together to get things done and help you. Local ISPs and alternative network providers, they're experts at getting permission from farmers to dig trenches and run things down the side of the field, which means no streetworks permit because nobody touched any public land. It was all in a field. once you get in and you get to know the local community, certainly in Orkney, you're going to be getting invited in for tea with lots of farmers and their wives, and that's a good thing because you actually start to become part of the community and understand what people need and how people benefit from it, and that can be really helpful as well, especially when you need to get someone's agreement and you say, look, I need to find somewhere to put a mast. Would this do? Would that do? Could you use my wind turbine? True story. People will help you in any way they can. They'll even bring the digger to try and dig the trench to lay the power and the fibre to help you get there quicker. People want better connectivity for themselves in the local community. And actually these people can be, significant enablers and actually really help you to get things done. You do need to prepare though. You need to prepare in advance. When you are working in rural areas, you're not going to be getting things delivered next day. You need to go with everything you require. But if you do get these things right, there's some things that we can think about going forwards, and we can start to look at what we do with these private networks that we've now got built in order to move towards the notion of neutral hosts. So we have to think about who you interconnect with and who's responsible for what. Clearly, these lines of delineation are really important in neutral host, commercially, technically, and for security reasons. And we have to respect that there are security concerns from everybody, and we need to make sure this works. One of the ideas of using third-party managed radios, that is actually still quite an adventurous concept in the world of neutral hosting, but perhaps shared rural network will give opportunities where people start to say, well, hang on a minute, this is really expensive to do ourselves. Perhaps there are other ways we could get this connectivity. I think there are certainly some challenges if we continue to go about trying to deploy full macro cells everywhere. The cost base is very high, especially for a rural area, and some of the alternatives that are now out there are starting to become more compelling. We also need to look at ways we can manage and handle spectrum. I alluded to this earlier, but generally where you are looking to build a private rural network, there's not going to be a huge amount of contention over the spectrum and worrying over quality of service and who's going to get what, and the private operator wanting to use the spectrum. The reality is we should be pragmatic here. They can apply for the spectrum, get access to it, and then just use it for themselves. There is lots of spectrum available, especially in the higher bands, and this should be straightforward to coordinate. But again, we have to keep this practical. If we are starting to use multiple bands and lots of different center frequencies and lots of different independent carriers to keep everyone happy by saying we're going to use your own spectrum, it's going to start to get much more expensive because you're going to need much more radios, you're going to need carrier aggregation, etc. And it's going to start to become quite a challenge. There's also considerations around, making a hybrid private and neutral hosted network as well. There's different goals between a use case specific network and a public telecoms network that a neutral host would be looking to emulate. It's not straightforward to do. There's, other things we've got to think about as well. Legacy telephony that play in there very significantly in emergency calling. 4G networks, 5G networks, you'd be looking at voice over LTE or voice over NR, the latter of which isn't really available yet. So you're going to have a 2G or a 3G network in parallel running to enable telephony and emergency calling, because voice over LTE is not actually, it's not actually there on all handsets yet. There's a lot of people with phones that don't support it, and there's a lot of MVNOs that don't support it as well, especially on non-contracting. But back to why we're doing this. This is, why we're doing this is what really matters, and our goal is to make sure that everyone's got access to the modern, digitally connected economy, and that includes rural areas. Everything's going increasingly digital. Payments have moved towards card and contactless much more so than before. Retail sales are focusing on cashless as well, especially in recent months. You can't get a two-factor text message code to log into your online bank in a lot of rural communities, and that can, that could be a real barrier, especially if you've got no signal at home and can't even get into your online banking. And in recent months, it's pretty clear that you're going to really struggle to work in a lot of white-collar jobs if you don't have good connectivity at home. There are 1.35 million households, though, in the UK still that have an upload speed that will be on average below 0.67 megs a second. Even with one person working, that's really not going to be enough to get a good experience on even a simple video call. As for how we go about doing it the best, well, most users don't really care how you do it. It comes down to what they can get and the benefit they can receive. People want to get online, they want to be better connected, they really want a phone signal. I was speaking to a journalist actually in Orkney, and they hadn't thought about the connectivity until I pointed out, but it's not normal to lose your phone signal when you're driving along the road and going to the next town. That's not normal. We have to keep in mind these perspectives that a lot of people have come to accept that what they've got is not very good, but actually they do want better, but they hadn't really thought about it as such until we approached and had that discussion. Now, the other thing we need to think about as well is public services are increasingly moving online, and it's incredibly important that everybody's got access to public services that are really important, especially recently. And in the past, we've often said, use the library to get online, but this is not an option when people are having to stay at home. People might be shielding, got the elderly and vulnerable, young people that need to, do their homework in the evenings for college or university. We can build private networks, but we need to remember that we're trying to keep people in touch with the rest of society, with each other, with their friends, and with their work. And we can build these private networks, but it's not going to provide all the solutions people need. They are going to benefit from the public telecom system, being able to get online onto the internet, but being able to make calls as well, and use the typical services everybody expects to. So the questions and the challenges that we see this are complex and aren't straightforward, but actually the end goal really is worth it if we can get people online. It's real people that don't have connections. And there's all the stories you can go and hear about, but you actually have to go and meet people that are having the problems with connectivity and see what you can do. And I think, being able to deploy private networks is certainly one thing, but we need to really start to look at how we can integrate private networks with opportunities for neutral hosts, especially in rural areas, so we can actually get people connected with the services they expect and want to use. So thanks for the time, and if you've got any questions, feel free to drop me an email, or I'll actually be around at the Q&A session that'll be happening in a few minutes' time after one of the next sessions. Thank you.